Hey everyone. In this video lecture, we'll discuss bad news messages, goals, and approaches. We'll start out by discussing the goals that you should keep in mind while you're crafting your bad news messages. And next, we'll talk about the circumstances under which you should choose a direct versus indirect approach to conveying bad news. So let's start out by discussing the goals that you should keep in mind while crafting bad news messages. Your first and most important goal is this. You want to focus on maintaining your relationship with your reader. Bad news, by its very nature, potentially threatens your relationship with your reader. You might be saying something that's upsetting or that angers them. And so you want to devote extra care and attention throughout your bad news messages to ensuring that you maintain a strong relationship with your reader at the end of that bad news message. That's the first and most important goal. Second, you want to focus on making the bad news clear, palatable, and final. Yes, you want to be tactful when you're conveying the bad news. That's the palatable component of this goal. But you also want to be clear and final. You don't want to run the risk of your reader potentially misunderstanding the bad news. Because if that's the case, you'll likely have to repeat the bad news, which is simply repeating the awkwardness and repeating the injury, right? So be palatable and tactful, yes, but also be clear and final when conveying your bad news. And your final goal is to protect your company or institution's interests. Yes, you want to maintain relationships. Yes, you want to be tactful while also being clear and final when conveying your bad news. But you also want to make sure that nothing you put on paper could get you, your company, or your institution into legal or financial trouble, right? It's the nature of bad news that it can potentially cause various kinds of headaches. So you want to be tactful, of course, but you also need to think strategically about what could cause problems for you in the future. So next, let's talk about the circumstances under which you would take a direct versus an indirect approach to conveying bad news. You would generally want to take a direct approach under any of the following circumstances. The first circumstance is this. If the bad news is urgent. The bad news is urgent, you don't want to run the risk of your audience, your reader, missing the point of your message, which is a risk that you always run when you take that indirect approach. So instead, if the bad news is urgent, if it's potentially life-threatening, just get straight to the point. You need to be clear. You need to be direct. You should also take a direct approach when the bad news is not so bad or if it's expected. If, for instance, you run out of coffee in the break room, hey, guess what? That's not that big of a deal. Just get straight to the point. Your colleagues will live. If the bad news is expected, you can also take a direct approach. Your readers, your audience, they've been potentially preparing themselves, bracing themselves for this bad news. And so you don't need to be quite so tactful as you would be in an indirect bad news message. And you can also take a direct approach if you're writing up, for instance, to a supervisor within an organization or a hierarchy. One of the burdens of leadership is that we have to deal with bad news. And so if you're writing to someone in a leadership position, just get straight to the point. It's part of their job description to deal with and navigate bad news on a regular basis. You should take an indirect approach to conveying bad news, on the other hand, if your bad news is not urgent, if your bad news is hard to take, if the bad news is unexpected, or if you're writing downward within an organization or hierarchy, or if you're writing outside of your company or institution. Now, a direct bad news message is basically just a tactful routine message. It opens with a clear, tactful statement of the bad news. That's the main point. It then moves on to providing a sensitive explanation of the bad news. That's the context. And it closes on a positive, forward-looking note. That's the goodwill, right? So we will remember that basic structure from earlier in this class with routine messages where you open with your main point. You then provide context if you have additional context that you need to convey, and you close with goodwill. You're going to use basically an identical structure when you're taking a direct approach to bad news. The big difference here is that you're just going to have to focus on being a little bit more tactful in the framing and the body of the message. So to put this into practice, let's take a look at an example. Dear team, despite everyone's best efforts to close more sales this past quarter, our revenue fell 14% compared to the third quarter last year. Reports from the field offices indicate that the economic downturn in Asia has reduced demand for our products. However, I continue to believe that we have the best products for these customers and will continue to explore ways to boost sales in these key markets. Thanks for your hard work, Halan. Now, you'll note that this has those three elements that we just talked about a moment ago. It begins by conveying the bad news, i.e. the main point of the message. Then the red text is where we convey context to support that main point, that bad news. And finally, we focus a lot of attention in that last purple section on strengthening our relationship with our readers by using tactful, focused, personalized goodwill. The biggest difference between this message and a standard issue routine message is not just the tactfulness of the tone, as we've discussed earlier, but perhaps even more importantly, the subject line. So in a routine message, you're typically going to use that subject line to indicate the action that you want your reader to take. In a direct bad news message, you're going to be a bit more oblique. You want to establish context in your subject line, but you don't want to give away the bad news. That's the one concession that you make to an indirect approach in a direct bad news message. So to sum things up, remember your three main goals when conveying bad news are to maintain your relationship with your reader, to make the bad news clear, palatable, and final, and to protect your company or institution's interests. Thanks for watching, everybody.